Most parents want their teenage kids to focus on school and maybe have a part-time job to learn responsibility, but my parents had a different plan that involved charging me $400 a month in rent while I was still in high school. And that decision didn't just affect my teenage years, it shaped my entire relationship with my family and taught me exactly where I stood in their priorities. So I'm 24 now, but this story starts when I was 16 years old and a junior in high school. And up until that point, I'd been a pretty normal teenager. Good grades, played soccer, had a part-time job at a local restaurant working maybe 15 hours a week just to have some spending money for movies and hanging out with friends. My parents sat me down one day in February of my junior year and told me they needed to talk about something important, and I figured maybe they were getting divorced or we were moving or something major like that based on how serious they looked. But instead, my dad said that now that I had a job and was getting older, I needed to start contributing to the household expenses. I didn't really understand what he meant at first, so I asked him to clarify, and he said that starting next month I'd be required to pay $400 per month in rent to continue living at home. Plus, I'd need to buy my own food and toiletries and anything else I needed, and if I couldn't pay the rent, then I'd need to find somewhere else to live. I honestly thought he was joking at first because who charges their 16-year-old high school student rent? But both my parents were completely serious, and my mom said this was about teaching me financial responsibility and preparing me for the real world, and I just sat there in shock trying to process what they were telling me. I was making maybe $250 a month at my restaurant job working part-time around my school schedule, which meant I'd need to more than double my income just to pay the rent they were demanding. And when I pointed this out, my dad said then I needed to get more hours or get a second job because $400 was non-negotiable. I asked them how I was supposed to work enough to make that much money while still going to school full-time and keeping up my grades, and my mom said plenty of teenagers work and go to school and I'd just need to learn time management, and I said yeah, but most teenagers aren't also paying rent to their own parents. My dad got angry and said I was being disrespectful and ungrateful, that they'd provided for me for 16 years and now it was time for me to start pulling my own weight. And if I didn't like their rules, I could move out. And I remember thinking, where exactly does he think a 16-year-old is going to move to? I asked if my younger brother, who was 13, would also have to start paying rent when he turned 16, and my parents exchanged this weird look, and my dad said they'd cross that bridge when they came to it, which I later learned meant no. They weren't planning to charge my brother rent. Apparently, this was just for me. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything I could think of to get them to change their minds. I showed them my budget and how impossible it would be to pay $400 a month while staying in school. I offered to do extra chores around the house instead of paying rent. I even got my school counselor to call them to explain how working that much would affect my education, but nothing worked, and they were completely firm on the $400 rent requirement starting March 1st. I ended up having to quit soccer, which I'd been playing since I was 8 years old because I couldn't afford the time commitment anymore, and I got a second job working at a grocery store, and between the two jobs I was working about 35 to 40 hours a week on top of going to school full-time, which meant I was basically working and going to school and sleeping, and that was my entire life. My grades started slipping immediately because I just didn't have time to do homework or study. I'd get home from my closing shift at the grocery store at 11 p.m. and have to be up at 6 a.m. for school, and I was constantly exhausted and stressed about money, and my parents' response to my declining grades was to tell me I needed to try harder and manage my time better. The $400 a month was due on the 1st of every month, and if I was even a day late, my dad would threaten to kick me out. And there were a few months where I literally had to choose between paying rent and buying food, and I'd go to school hungry because I'd given all my money to my parents. My friends started noticing that something was wrong because I never had money to do anything with them, and I was always exhausted and stressed, and when I finally told my best friend Katie what was happening, she was horrified and said that wasn't normal, and her parents would never do that to her, and she talked to her mom who offered to let me stay with them, but I was too ashamed to take them up on it because I felt like it was my failure that I couldn't handle what my parents were asking of me. I asked my parents multiple times if there was a financial emergency or if they were struggling with money, and that's why they needed the rent from me. And they said no, they were fine financially. This was purely about teaching me responsibility. And I remember thinking, how is it responsible to force your kid to work 40 hours a week and tank their education? My teachers started pulling me aside, asking if everything was okay at home because my grades had dropped from mostly A's and B's to mostly C's and D's, and I was falling asleep in class, and I didn't know what to tell them because I was embarrassed to admit that my parents were charging me rent, so I just made up excuses about not sleeping well. The worst part was watching my younger brother continue to live a normal teenage life. He played video games and hung out with friends and played on the basketball team and never had to worry about money, while I was working myself to death just to have a place to sleep at night. And my parents never acknowledged how unfair that was. I tried to talk to my mom about it one time, asking her why they were only making me pay rent and not my brother, and she said every child is different and they parent us according to what we need, and apparently what I needed was to be financially exploited, while what my brother needed was a normal childhood. There were times when I genuinely considered just leaving and trying to make it on my own, but I was 16 with no car and nowhere to go, and I was terrified that if I left, I'd end up homeless or worse, so I just kept working and paying the rent and trying to survive. My relationship with my parents completely deteriorated during this time. I resented them so much for what they were doing to me, and they seemed to resent me for not being more grateful for the lesson they were teaching me, and we barely spoke except for them to remind me about rent being due or to criticize me for something. I started having panic attacks about money. I'd lie awake at night calculating my hours and my paychecks and trying to figure out if I'd have enough to cover rent, and if something unexpected came up like needing new work shoes or my phone breaking, it would throw off my entire budget and send me into a spiral. Junior year turned into senior year, and I was still paying the $400 a month, still working 2 jobs, still barely scraping by, and I'd given up on the idea of going to college because I hadn't had time to study for the SATs or work on applications, and my grades were too poor to get into anywhere decent anyway. My school counselor tried to help me apply to some local community colleges, and we worked on applications during my lunch period, but I knew that even if I got in, I couldn't afford to go because I'd still need to pay my parents' rent and tuition, and I was already maxed out on work hours. I graduated high school with a 2.4 GPA when I'd been on track for a 3.7 before all this started, and I didn't walk at graduation because I had to work, and my parents didn't seem to care or acknowledge that they'd essentially destroyed my academic future for $400 a month. After graduation, I sat down with my parents and told them I wanted to move out, and they seemed surprised, like they'd expected me to just keep living there and paying them rent indefinitely. And my dad actually said that if I moved out, I'd realize how good I had it at home, and I told him that paying $400 a month to sleep on a couch in someone's living room would be better than staying there because at least that person wouldn't be my parent who was supposed to love and support me. I moved out 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. I'd been saving every penny I could beyond the rent money for almost a year specifically so I could leave, and I got a tiny studio apartment that cost $600 a month but came with utilities included, and I didn't have to see my parents every day. My mom cried when I left and said she couldn't believe I was abandoning the family, and I told her that they'd abandoned me 2 years ago when they decided to treat me like a tenant instead of their child, and she said I was being dramatic and someday I'd understand they were just trying to help me. I worked full-time at both my jobs for a few more months until I could quit one and just work at the grocery store. And I started taking classes at community college, 1 or 2 at a time as I could afford them, and it took me 6 years to get my associate's degree because I had to work full-time and could only take classes part-time, but I did it completely on my own without any help from my parents. My relationship with my parents has never recovered. I see them maybe twice a year at most, and we have very surface-level conversations, and they act like nothing happened and can't understand why I'm not close with them, and when I've tried to talk to them about how much damage the rent situation did, they say they were just parenting the way they thought was best, and I'm holding a grudge. My brother, who never had to pay rent and got to go to college right after high school on my parents' dime, is their golden child, and they're constantly comparing me to him and asking why I can't be more successful like he is, and I've stopped trying to explain that maybe I'd be more successful if I hadn't spent my teenage years working 40 hours a week to pay rent instead of focusing on school. I'm in therapy now, working through a lot of anger and resentment, and my therapist has helped me understand that what my parents did was a form of financial abuse and exploitation. And it wasn't about teaching me responsibility, it was about them having control and treating me like a source of income rather than their child. I've learned that several of my extended family members knew what was happening and thought it was wrong but didn't intervene, And I've distanced myself from them too, because if you knew a child was being exploited and did nothing, then you're complicit in that exploitation. The worst part is that my parents still don't think they did anything wrong. They genuinely believe that charging me rent at 16 while I was in high school was good parenting, and they've told other people about it like it's something to be proud of. Like they were tough love parents who taught their kid the value of hard work. I've connected with other people online who had similar experiences with their parents charging them rent as teenagers, and it's been validating to hear that I'm not crazy for thinking this was abusive and harmful. And it's also been heartbreaking to learn how common this is and how many parents exploit their kids financially under the guise of teaching responsibility. I'm doing okay now at 24. I have my associate's degree, and I'm working on my bachelor's degree slowly. I have a decent job in retail management and my own apartment, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished despite the massive setback my parents created. But I also think about who I could have been and what I could have achieved if I'd been allowed to just be a kid and focus on school like my peers. My brother and I have a complicated relationship because he benefited from the same parents who exploited me, and while it's not his fault that they treated us differently, it's hard not to feel resentful that he got a normal childhood and college paid for while I got to work 2 jobs and barely graduate high school. He's asked me a few times why I'm not closer with our parents and why I don't come to family events, and I've tried to explain what they did to me, but he doesn't really get it because he didn't experience it, and he thinks I should just forgive and move on because that's what family does. I've had to accept that my parents are never going to apologize or acknowledge the harm they caused, and that means I have to decide what kind of relationship I want with them going forward. And right now, that relationship is minimal contact and strong boundaries, and I'm okay with that, even though it makes some family members uncomfortable. I've also had to work through a lot of internalized shame about not being more successful by society's standards, because I'm 24 with an associate's degree and a retail job, while my peers who had normal childhoods are finishing master's degrees and starting careers, and my therapist has helped me reframe that and recognize that I'm actually incredibly resilient and successful considering what I overcame. There are still days when I'm angry about everything that was taken from me. The normal teenage years I never got to have, the educational opportunities I missed, the relationship with my parents that was destroyed, but I'm trying to focus on moving forward and building the life I want rather than dwelling on what could have been. I've decided that when I have kids someday, I'm going to do everything completely differently. I'm going to make sure they know they're loved and supported unconditionally, and that their job as teenagers is to be teenagers, not to financially support themselves or pay rent to their own parents, and I'm going to break this cycle of exploitation and control. Looking back, I wish I'd reached out for more help at the time. I wish I'd told teachers or called CPS or accepted my friend's mom's offer to stay with them, but I was a kid and I didn't know what my options were, and I was ashamed and didn't want anyone to know what was happening. So if you're a teenager going through something similar, or you know a teenager whose parents are exploiting them financially, please know that this isn't normal or okay, and there are resources and people who can help, and you deserve better than to be treated like a source of income by the people who are supposed to protect you. What are your thoughts on parents charging their teenage kids rent while they're still in high school? Is this ever justified, or is it always a form of abuse? Share your perspective in the comments because I'd really love to hear what others think about this, and if my story resonated with you or opened your eyes to financial abuse in families, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video because it helps us share more stories like this. Thanks for listening to my story, and I'll catch you next time.